He thought he was untouchable. He thought his money made him invincible. He thought wearing AirPods in a courtroom and scrolling through his phone while a judge spoke directly to his face was just another power move in a life full of power moves. But the moment Judge Judy stopped mid-sentence, locked her eyes onto his, and asked him one single question, every ounce of arrogance drained from his body like water through a cracked glass. His smirk vanished. His phone slipped from his fingers and clattered against the defendant's table. And the silence that followed was so heavy, so suffocating, that even the camera operators held their breath. What happened in the next 47 minutes didn't just embarrass Blake Harrington. It didn't just cost him the case. Within 72 hours of this episode airing, his $40 million tech company would be worthless. His investors would abandon him in a joint public statement calling his behavior deeply disturbing. His own employees would file a class action lawsuit exposing years of abuse. His board of directors would vote unanimously to remove him and release a statement calling him a disgrace to the industry he claimed to lead. But none of it, compares to the single court order Judge Judy issued from that bench. An order so unprecedented, so legally devastating, that 3 corporate attorneys who reviewed the case afterward called it the most brilliant judicial move they had ever witnessed on television. One order. That's all it took to end everything Blake Harrington had built. And it started with a pair of AirPods he refused to take out of his ears. Blake Harrington sat in the defendant's chair that Tuesday morning the way most people sit in airport lounges. Legs crossed. Back reclined. One arm draped lazily over the chair beside him. His custom-tailored navy suit had no tie because ties were for people who still played by old rules. His designer sneakers probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. And lodged firmly in both ears, gleaming white against his styled hair, were his AirPods Pro. He was scrolling through his phone without even glancing at the courtroom around him. Not at the judge. Not at the cameras. Not at the gallery filled with people who were already staring at him with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong building and was killing time until his Uber arrived. He was 34 years old. He was the founder and CEO of Nexigen Technologies, a data analytics company based in Austin, Texas, that had been valued at $40 million by investors who believed his vision was going to reshape the industry. Magazine profiles called him a disruptor. Tech conferences gave him keynote slots. He drove a matte black Porsche Taycan with custom plates that read Disrupt. And he had never, not once in his entire life, been told no by anyone who had the power to make it stick. That was about to change in ways he could not have imagined in his worst nightmares. Across from him, at the plaintiff's table, sat a woman who could not have been more different. Diane Caldwell was 61 years old. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a folder so thick with documents that it barely stayed closed. Her gray cardigan was modest, her shoes practical, her expression a mixture of fear and quiet determination that comes from someone who has been pushed past every breaking point and decided to stand up anyway. Diane had been a senior software engineer at Nexigen Technologies for 11 years. She was employee number 14. Hired when the company was still operating out of a co-working space with folding tables and borrowed Wi-Fi. She had built the core architecture of the product that now generated $22 million in annual revenue. She held 3 patents filed under Nexigen's name. She had trained every junior engineer who walked through those doors for over a decade. And then, at the age of 60, after 11 years of outstanding performance reviews, after building the very foundation that Blake's empire stood on, she was erased. Terminated. Her name scrubbed from internal documentation. Her contributions attributed to others. Her career destroyed by the man sitting across from her who couldn't even be bothered to take his AirPods out in a courtroom. If you believe no one is above the law, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment the city you're watching from right now. Let's see how far this story reaches. Judge Judy had reviewed thousands of cases in her career. 25 years on the family court bench in New York, followed by decades of television, had given her an almost supernatural ability to read people within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. She could spot liars before they finished their first sentence. She could identify manipulators by the way they shifted their weight. She could sense cruelty hiding behind charm the way a surgeon could feel a tumor beneath the skin. And when Blake Harrington's case file landed on her desk, every alarm bell she had went off simultaneously. Not because of the dollar amount. Not because of the legal complexity. But because of the pattern she saw buried in the paperwork. A pattern she had seen before in con artists, in predators, in people who used power the way others used weapons. She made a rare request to her production team. She wanted 3 full days to prepare instead of the usual one. Her research team pulled corporate filings, deposition transcripts from a previously settled lawsuit, anonymous employee reviews from job boards, and financial records that painted a picture far darker than a simple wrongful termination. They also obtained something that Blake's legal team did not know existed. An internal company Slack message thread between Blake and his HR director, in which the two of them discussed Diane's termination in language so explicit, so calculated, and so damning that reading it aloud in a courtroom would do more than embarrass him. It would end him. Judge Judy placed that Slack transcript at the bottom of her folder on the morning of the hearing. She wouldn't need it right away. She was going to let Blake's arrogance build the case against himself first. She was going to let him smirk, dismiss, deflect, and disrespect his way into a trap so complete that by the time she pulled out the final evidence, there would be nowhere left to run. Because Judge Judy didn't just want to win this case. She wanted to make an example that every arrogant bully in America would remember for the rest of their lives. But before we get to the moment that destroyed his empire, you need to understand exactly who Blake Harrington was, what he did to Diane Caldwell, and why Judge Judy spent 3 days preparing for this case like it was personal. Because it was. Blake Harrington didn't build Nexigen Technologies from nothing, no matter how many magazine profiles said otherwise. He built it from his father's checkbook. At 23 years old, fresh out of a business degree he barely passed, Blake received a $750,000 seed investment from his father, a retired hedge fund manager who believed his son was destined for greatness simply because he had never allowed him to experience failure. Blake took that money, hired a team of engineers who were smarter than him in every measurable way, and positioned himself as the visionary founder of a data analytics company that would supposedly reshape how corporations understood their customers. Within 3 years, Nexigen Technologies was valued at $40 million. Tech magazines profiled Blake as a self-made disruptor. Conference organizers fought to book him for keynotes. Investors lined up to shake his hand. But inside the walls of Nexigen's Austin headquarters, a very different story was playing out. Every major innovation, every breakthrough feature, every patent that made Nexigen profitable came from engineers Blake underpaid, overworked, and refused to credit publicly. He ran the company the way a dictator runs a small country. Employees described a culture built on fear, retaliation, and public humiliation so routine that new hires were warned about it during their first week. Blake held weekly all-hands meetings that his staff privately called the arena. Standing at the front of the room with his sleeves rolled up and his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who genuinely enjoyed watching people squirm, he would call out underperforming employees by name. He didn't offer feedback. He offered destruction. He once told a junior developer in front of 200 coworkers that his code looked like it was written by a child with a crayon. He once fired a pregnant woman for taking a single sick day and told his HR director afterward that weakness is a disease that spreads and I won't let it infect this company. He drove his matte black Porsche Taycan with the custom plates that read "Disrupt" into his reserved parking spot every morning like a general arriving at a battlefield. And in 34 years of life, not one single person in a position of real authority had ever looked him in the eye and told him no. Not his father. Not his investors. Not his board. Not a single one of the hundreds of employees who watched him humiliate their colleagues and said nothing because they were terrified of becoming the next target. That unbroken streak of zero accountability is what made Blake Harrington walk into Judge Judy's courtroom with AirPods in his ears and a smirk on his face. He genuinely did not believe consequences applied to him. He was about to learn otherwise. Diane Caldwell never wanted to be famous. She never wanted to be on television. She never wanted any of this. All she ever wanted was to do her job, build good software, and go home to a quiet life. She joined Nexigen as employee number 14 when the company was still operating out of a co-working space with mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that barely worked. Blake hired her specifically to build the core architecture of the company's flagship product because despite all his bluster about vision and disruption, he needed someone who could actually write the code that turned his promises into reality. Diane was that person. For 11 years, she worked 60-hour weeks without complaint. She missed Thanksgivings and birthdays and her niece's graduation. She stayed late debugging systems while Blake left early to attend tech parties. She held 3 patents that were filed under Nexigen's name. She personally trained every junior engineer who walked through the door. The product that now generated $22 million in annual revenue ran on architecture that Diane designed from the ground up. She was, by every objective measure, the technical backbone of the entire company. And then she turned 60. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. Blake began reassigning Diane from critical projects to meaningless tasks that had no impact on the company's operations. He excluded her from leadership meetings she had attended for a decade. He promoted a 26-year-old engineer with exactly 2 years of experience to be her direct supervisor and gave him one instruction: document every mistake she makes, no matter how small. When Diane recognized the pattern and filed an internal complaint about age discrimination, Blake called her into his office. He put his feet on his desk, leaned back in his chair, and said 5 words that Diane would never forget. Innovation requires fresh blood, not fossils. She was terminated the following week. The official reason cited on her paperwork was performance deficiencies, despite 11 consecutive years of excellent and outstanding performance reviews. Her severance was $4,200. Roughly 1 week of pay for every year she had given to the company. Nexigen kept her patents, her code, and her contributions. They scrubbed her name from internal documentation so thoroughly that new employees had no idea she had ever existed. The woman who built the engine was erased from the machine. What followed was the cruelest chapter of all. Diane used her savings to consult an employment attorney who told her that litigating the case through traditional channels would cost approximately $200,000 and take at least 3 years. She couldn't afford it. As the months passed, she lost her apartment because her savings ran dry. She moved in with her sister, sleeping in a spare bedroom that doubled as a storage closet. She applied for 47 jobs in her field and was rejected from every single one. She couldn't understand it until a former colleague quietly told her the truth. Nexigen's HR department was giving negative references to every company that called, telling them Diane was terminated for cause, despite a signed separation agreement that explicitly prohibited any such disclosure. Blake Harrington hadn't just fired Diane Caldwell. He had systematically destroyed her ability to ever work again. He had erased her past, sabotaged her future, and left her with nothing. And he had done it all while smiling for magazine covers and accepting awards for leadership excellence. When Judge Judy's research team received Diane's case file, they flagged it immediately. But what caught their attention wasn't just Diane's story. It was the pattern. Over the previous months, 7 former Nexigen employees had independently contacted the show with nearly identical complaints. A CEO who used intimidation to silence dissent. A company culture that discarded older employees like expired inventory. Legal threats deployed against anyone who dared to push back. Judge Judy personally reviewed every file and made a request her production team had rarely heard in decades of working with her. She wanted 3 full days to prepare. Her team pulled corporate filings, deposition transcripts from a previously settled lawsuit, anonymous employee reviews from job boards, and financial records that revealed a systematic pattern of discrimination stretching back years. And then they obtained the piece of evidence that would change everything. A former Nexigen employee, disgusted by what he had witnessed, provided the show with an internal Slack message thread between Blake Harrington and his HR director. In that thread, written in Blake's own words, was a conversation so explicit, so calculating, and so damning that it didn't just prove Diane's case. It proved that Blake knew exactly what he was doing, planned every step of it, and laughed while doing it. Judge Judy placed that transcript at the bottom of her folder and closed it. She wouldn't need it right away. She was going to let Blake build the case against himself first. Judge Judy had the evidence. She had the preparation. She had the fury of a woman who had spent 25 years protecting people from predators exactly like Blake Harrington. All she needed was for him to walk into her courtroom and give her a reason. And when he sat down in the defendant's chair, put in his AirPods, and smirked at the cameras, he gave her everything she needed and more. Diane Caldwell took the stand with her thick folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Her voice was quiet at first, barely reaching the gallery, but as she began describing her 11 years at Nexigen, something shifted. She talked about building the core architecture of the product that made the company profitable. She held up copies of 3 patents filed under Nexigen's name, patents built on her technical specifications, her late nights, her expertise. She read aloud from the termination letter that cited performance deficiencies and then placed it beside 11 consecutive years of performance reviews rated excellent and outstanding. Her voice cracked when she described Blake calling her a fossil to her face. It broke entirely when she described losing her apartment and moving into her sister's spare room. She described applying for 47 jobs and being rejected from every one because the company that erased her contributions was also poisoning her reputation behind her back. The gallery was completely still. Several audience members wiped their eyes. An older woman in the back row reached for her husband's hand and held it tight. Diane's pain filled the courtroom like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. Then Judge Judy turned to the defendant's table for Blake's response. Blake did not look up from his phone. Judge Judy spoke his name again, louder this time. Blake glanced up for half a second, then looked back down at his screen as if the interruption was beneath him. Judge Judy's voice dropped to that dangerously quiet tone that anyone who had watched her show for more than a single episode recognized instantly. Mr. Harrington, remove the AirPods. Blake smirked without lifting his eyes and said casually, as if he were answering an assistant who had asked an obvious question, "I'm listening, Your Honor." "I can multitask." The courtroom went dead silent. Not the ordinary silence of a pause between speakers, but the airless, suffocating silence of an entire room collectively realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his belt. Diane covered her mouth. Gallery members froze mid-breath. Judge Judy did not blink. She did not raise her voice. She stared at Blake for a full 5 seconds, her expression hardening into something that went beyond anger into a territory that seasoned attorneys recognized as the last warning before total annihilation. "I am going to ask you one more time. Remove the AirPods from your ears. Put your phone away. And show this court the basic respect that every person in this room is entitled to. Including the woman whose career you destroyed." Blake finally looked up. For the first time since walking through those doors, something in his expression shifted. He registered that the energy in this room was different from anything he had encountered before. But his arrogance had been reinforced for 34 unbroken years and it would not let him yield. He reached up, pulled out one AirPod, just one, and placed it on the table with a deliberate slowness designed to communicate that he was doing this as a favor. He let out a half laugh. "Happy now?" Judge Judy's response came like a blade wrapped in ice. "No. I am not." And by the time we are done here, neither will you be. She opened the folder on her desk with the calm precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. She pulled out Diane's performance reviews and read the ratings aloud. Excellent. Outstanding. Excellent. Outstanding. 11 years in a row without a single documented concern. Then she picked up the termination letter and read the reason for dismissal. Performance deficiencies. She held both documents side by side, turning them toward the camera so 12 million viewers could see the contradiction with their own eyes. Mr. Harrington, can you explain how an employee goes from outstanding to terminated in the span of 2 weeks? The same 2 weeks, coincidentally, in which she filed an age discrimination complaint. Blake shifted in his chair. His smirk faltered for the first time as the connection was laid bare in front of the entire country. He attempted the kind of corporate deflection that had always worked in boardrooms and investor calls. Your Honor, performance management is a complex process and sometimes patterns emerge that annual reviews don't capture. Judge Judy's eyebrows rose slowly. Patterns. Like the pattern of you firing employees over 55 and replacing them with people in their 20s at half the salary? She held up another document, a spreadsheet compiled by her research team showing 12 employees over the age of 55 who had been terminated from Nexigen in the past 3 years. Every single one had been replaced by someone under 30. The gallery gasped. Blake's remaining AirPod was still in his ear. His phone was still in his hand. And Judge Judy was just getting started. But the termination records and performance reviews were just the opening. Because Judge Judy had something else in that folder. A Slack message thread between Blake and his HR director that was never supposed to see the light of day. And when she reads it aloud, the courtroom will erupt in a way that has never happened before on this show. Judge Judy signaled the bailiff, who walked a printed document to the defendant's table and placed it directly in front of Blake Harrington. Mr. Harrington, do you recognize this? Blake's eyes dropped to the paper. The Nexigen company logo sat at the top of the page. The color drained from his face so fast it was visible even on the gallery's furthest bench. Judge Judy did not wait for his answer. She began reading aloud, her voice steady and deliberate, letting every word land with its full weight. This is a Slack message from you to your HR director, dated 2 days before Mrs. Caldwell's termination. The message reads, and I quote, DC filed the complaint like I knew she would. Perfect timing. Build the paper trail this week. Make it look performance-based. I want her out before she turns this into a lawsuit. She's too old to fight us and too broke to hire anyone good. The courtroom exploded. Gasps swept through the gallery like a shockwave. Diane pressed both hands against her face as tears poured down her cheeks. One audience member stood up in outrage before the bailiff gestured him back to his seat. And Blake Harrington, the man who had walked in scrolling his phone with the unshakable confidence of someone who believed he was above every rule ever written, sat perfectly still as his remaining AirPod slipped from his ear and clattered softly onto the table beside his forgotten phone. For the first time in his 34 years of life, he had absolutely nothing to say. But Judge Judy was not finished. She turned the page and continued reading. This is your HR director's response. Done. I will backdate the performance improvement plan. Do we need to worry about the patents? She looked up at Blake, then back down at the paper. And here is your reply, Mr. Harrington. The patents are ours. She signed the IP agreement. She gets nothing. Judge Judy placed the document flat on the bench and stared at Blake with an expression that could have cracked stone. She gets nothing. That is what you said about a woman who spent 11 years of her life building the product that made you a millionaire. Blake's voice came out thin and cracked, stripped of every layer of confidence he had carried into that room. Those messages are taken out of context. Judge Judy's response landed like a guillotine. Then please provide me with the context in which planning to fabricate a paper trail to illegally terminate a 60-year-old woman is acceptable. I will wait. Blake said nothing. The courtroom said nothing. The silence was its own verdict. Judge Judy turned to the bailiff. Bring in the first witness. The doors opened and Tom Peretti walked in. He was 42 years old, a former engineering manager at Nexigen who had resigned 6 months earlier. He took the stand and stated his name clearly. Judge Judy asked him a single question. Mr. Peretti, were you ever instructed to take actions against Mrs. Caldwell? Tom's answer was direct and devastating. Yes. Blake Harrington personally told me to reassign Diane to projects that had no impact on the company. Dead-end work designed to make her feel useless. He told me to start documenting minor errors that we would normally never flag for any employee. When I pushed back and told him this felt wrong, he looked me straight in the eye and said either you help me clean house or you are next. The gallery buzzed with outrage. Tom continued, his voice growing stronger as the truth he had carried for months finally poured out. There was a term used inside leadership meetings for employees over 50. Legacy weight. Blake used it openly. He joked about wanting Nexigen to look like a college campus. He said older employees were slowing down innovation and that the company needed to shed weight to stay competitive. Everyone in those meetings understood exactly what he meant. Heads in the gallery shook in disbelief as the systematic nature of Blake's discrimination became undeniable. Judge Judy called the second witness. Priya Nair, 38, a former HR analyst at Nexigen, entered the courtroom holding a folder of printed emails. She testified that after Diane's termination, she was directly instructed by Blake to give negative references to any company that called about Diane. She held up the email containing Blake's exact words. If anyone calls about her, tell them she was terminated for cause. I do not care what the agreement says. She is not getting hired anywhere. Diane broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs that carried 11 years of confusion and pain. She had spent months wondering why 47 applications had been rejected, why no one would give her a chance, why the career she had built over decades seemed to have vanished overnight. Now she knew. It was not the job market. It was not her age. It was not her skills. It was him. A woman seated in the gallery whispered just loud enough for the microphones to catch it. He tried to erase her. Judge Judy's jaw tightened visibly. She turned back to Blake. Blake, now drenched in sweat, his designer suit looking less like armor and more like a costume he no longer deserved to wear, attempted one final corporate deflection. Your Honor, running a company requires making difficult decisions. Mrs. Caldwell was simply not meeting the evolving needs of the organization. Judge Judy reached into her folder and held up the patent filings. The evolving needs of the organization. You mean the organization that is currently generating $22 million in annual revenue from a product she built? The product that carries 3 patents bearing her technical specifications? The product that your entire company depends on for survival? Those evolving needs? Blake opened his mouth but nothing came out. His arrogance had been stripped away layer by layer across the last 30 minutes, and what remained underneath was exactly what Judge Judy had suspected from the first moment she read his case file. Nothing. There was nothing underneath. No substance. No integrity. No accountability. Just a man who had spent his entire adult life being protected from consequences by money and power, and who had just discovered that neither worked inside these walls. If you are watching this and you believe people like Blake need to face real consequences, drop a like right now, hit subscribe so you never miss another moment of justice, and comment your city below. Let's fill the comments with people who stand with Diane. But Judge Judy was not done. She was building towards something no one in that courtroom expected. A single court order so powerful, so unprecedented, that Blake's own attorneys would later call it the moment the company died. And it all hinged on one final piece of evidence that Blake himself had accidentally created. Judge Judy reached into her folder one final time and pulled out the last document. It was a transcript of an audio recording from a Nexigen all-hands meeting held exactly 1 month after Diane Caldwell's termination. She held it up so Blake could see it and watched the last traces of defiance drain from his face. Then she read it aloud, slowly, giving every word the space to detonate. Some of you might have heard that Diane Caldwell is no longer with us. Let me be clear. She was dead weight. She was holding this company back. If you are over 40 and you are not performing at the level of someone half your age, you should be worried too. This company has no room for people coasting on tenure. The courtroom gasped. Diane's hands flew to her chest. The gallery sat in stunned horror as the words of a man who had publicly celebrated destroying a woman's career echoed through the chamber. Judge Judy placed the transcript down and looked directly at Blake. You said this to your entire company. On the record. 1 month after illegally terminating a woman for filing a discrimination complaint. Blake's voice came out as barely a whisper, cracked and hollow. That was motivational. I was trying to push the team. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair and let the absurdity of his answer hang in the air for 3 full seconds before responding. Motivational. You threatened every employee over 40 in your company with termination. You publicly celebrated firing a woman who built your core product. You called her dead weight in front of 200 people. And you call that motivation? She paused. The courtroom held its breath. Then she delivered the line that would be replayed millions of times across every screen in America. Mr. Harrington, you are not a CEO. You are a bully with a bank account. And today, the bank account stops protecting you. Judge Judy straightened in her chair and her voice shifted from fury to the cold, measured precision of a verdict that had been building across every piece of evidence, every witness, and every lie Blake had told inside those walls. Mr. Harrington, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Diane Caldwell, on every count. She laid out the judgment with surgical clarity. Full back pay calculated at Diane's highest documented salary across 11 years of service. Damages for the emotional distress caused by a deliberate campaign of workplace harassment and wrongful termination. Damages for defamation resulting from the illegal negative references that sabotaged 47 job applications. Full reimbursement of all legal costs and job search expenses Diane had incurred while trying to rebuild the life Blake had systematically destroyed. The total reached the maximum amount the court could award. But Judge Judy was not finished. She announced a formal referral of the case to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Texas Attorney General's Office for Criminal Investigation into systematic age discrimination at Nexigen Technologies. Then she did something unprecedented. She issued a formal judicial recommendation, entered into the public record and transmitted to every relevant regulatory body, that Nexigen Technologies be investigated for a pattern of discriminatory employment practices spanning multiple years. She ordered that the Slack messages, the all-hands recording transcript, the witness testimony, and the employee termination records all be preserved and transmitted as evidence. She stated on camera, with the full authority of her bench, that in her professional opinion this was not an isolated incident involving one employee but a systematic company-wide pattern of illegal age discrimination directed from the very top of the organization. Blake's attorney shot to his feet. Your Honor, you cannot issue a recommendation that broad based on a single case. Judge Judy's eyes locked onto him with the kind of stare that ended arguments before they started. I just did. And every investor, every client, and every employee of your company is about to find out exactly what kind of man is running it. This is a public courtroom, Mr. Harrington. And the public is watching. Blake sat motionless. His face was drained of every shade of color. The AirPods sat abandoned on the table beside his forgotten phone like relics from a life that had ended minutes ago. His hands trembled against the wood. He opened his mouth to speak but nothing came. The gallery erupted in applause that rolled through the chamber like thunder, and the bailiff made no move to quiet it. Diane was sobbing, not the broken sobs of pain that had marked her testimony, but the heaving, shaking sobs of a woman whose silence had finally been shattered after 11 years. The older woman in the gallery, who had been clutching her husband's hand throughout the entire case, stood from her seat and called out clearly enough for every microphone to capture it. "Thank you, Judge." Judge Judy nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then raised her gavel and brought it down with a single definitive strike. Case closed. But the courtroom ruling was only the beginning. What happened to Blake Harrington and Nexigen Technologies in the 72 hours after this episode aired would become one of the most dramatic corporate collapses in recent memory and prove that Judge Judy's one order was more powerful than any boardroom coup, any investor revolt, or any lawsuit could ever be. The episode aired on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Tuesday evening the internet had already made its verdict. Clips of Blake Harrington sitting with AirPods in his ears while Judge Judy spoke directly to him spread across every platform within minutes. The Slack message reading went viral first. "She is too old to fight us and too broke to hire anyone good" became the most shared courtroom quote of the year. Blake's smirk was turned into a meme template overnight. The 6-second clip of his AirPod falling from his ear onto the table after the Slack messages were read aloud was viewed 30 million times in the first 24 hours. The hashtags AirPod CEO, Justice for Diane, and Judge Judy ended him trended simultaneously across 3 platforms and did not stop trending for days. By midnight, Nexigen's 3 largest investors released a joint statement calling the footage deeply disturbing and announcing an immediate review of their financial relationship with the company. By morning, 2 of the 3 had formally withdrawn their funding. Nexigen's $40 million valuation, built entirely on future growth projections and investor confidence, began collapsing in real time. Tech journalists who had once profiled Blake as a visionary started publishing retractions and investigations. A former board member gave an anonymous interview confirming that concerns about Blake's behavior had been raised internally for years but were dismissed because the company was profitable. Then the employees spoke. Current Nexigen staff began posting on anonymous job boards and social media, confirming every detail of Tom and Priya's courtroom testimony. 12 employees filed a joint complaint with the EEOC. 6 submitted resignation letters that were shared publicly. 1 engineer wrote words that were screenshotted and shared hundreds of thousands of times. "I watched a 61-year-old woman get justice on television that we could not get inside our own company. I am ashamed I stayed silent." Blake's HR director, the same one who received the Slack messages about building a paper trail, resigned and retained her own attorney. Nexigen's head of legal counsel resigned the same day. Within 72 hours, the board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Blake Harrington as CEO. They released a public statement acknowledging systemic failures and pledging full cooperation with every regulatory investigation. Blake's name was scrubbed from the company website. His access to all systems was revoked. The matte black Porsche Taycan with disrupt plates was photographed leaving the company parking garage for the last time. Diane Caldwell's life took a very different path. A GoFundMe campaign organized by viewers raised over $250,000 in 48 hours. Diane accepted with tearful gratitude and donated a significant portion to legal aid organizations that help workers fight workplace discrimination. She received 3 job offers within the first week. She accepted a senior advisory role at a non-profit dedicated to protecting older workers in the technology sector. She told a reporter, "I spent 11 years building someone else's dream. Now I am going to spend the rest of my career making sure no one else gets erased the way I was." She was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on age discrimination. Her 3 patents became the subject of a separate legal action filed on contingency by her new attorneys. The case sparked a national conversation that changed how major companies reviewed their own practices. Employment attorneys reported a 40% increase in age discrimination consultations in the month that followed. Blake Harrington disappeared from public life. His social media was deleted. His LinkedIn was removed. The man who once told a 61-year-old woman she was too old to fight back learned the hardest lesson of his life. Justice does not care about your net worth, your title, or your AirPods. The episode closes with Judge Judy's words replayed one final time. You are not a CEO. You are a bully with a bank account. And today the bank account stops protecting you. This story is proof that arrogance always has an expiration date. Blake walked in believing he was above consequences. He walked out as a cautionary tale. Diane walked in trembling, silenced, and erased. She walked out heard, vindicated, and free. If this story moved you, if you believe in justice for people like Diane, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss another story where arrogance meets accountability, and comment the city you are watching from. Let's fill the comments and show the world that people everywhere stand against bullies who think power makes them untouchable.